Thank you. Thank you, Maurizio. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased that I get the opportunity to discuss here today my concept of non-local consciousness based on scientific research on near-death experience, NDE, in survivors of cardiac arrest, and especially to discuss into more detail the mystery of perception during such an experience. A near-death experience or an experience of enhanced consciousness during a period of apparent coma still gives rise to many unbelieving and critical questions, especially by physicians and neuroscientists. But as already 1 century ago William James has said, to study the abnormal is the best way of understanding the normal. How can it scientifically be explained that people can have clear memories or even verifiable perceptions from a period of obvious unconsciousness? In my recently released book, Consciousness Beyond Life, The Science of the Near-Death Experience, I write in many more details about my ideas about non-local consciousness than I can explain here today in my lecture. But I also realize that many aspects of consciousness and perception are still a great mystery. First, I would like to discuss some of my ideas about the relationship between consciousness and the brain. And I realize that my approach will be new or unexpected for most neuroscientists, and that my conclusions will not always be in conformity with the currently widely accepted materialistic paradigm in Western science. Important questions for me were, how was consciousness related to the integrity of brain function? Is it possible to gain insight in this relationship? How is it possible that sometimes patients can report enhanced consciousness when they are unconscious under general anesthesia during surgery? Could there be still consciousness when someone in coma has been declared brain dead by his neurologist and the procedure of organ donation should be started? Or when someone is clinical dead during cardiac arrest? By asking these questions, my interest in NDE started in 1969 during my rotating internship. A patient was successfully resuscitated in the coronary care unit by electrical defibrillation. In those days, this was all new and exciting for us. We mostly do not realize anymore that until 1967, only 45 years ago, all patients with cardiac arrest died because of modern resuscitation techniques like defibrillation and external chest compression were not yet available, only 45 years ago. But this patient regained consciousness after a period of unconsciousness of about 4 minutes. We as a resuscitation team were of course very, very happy. But the patient seemed to be very, very disappointed. He told me I was going through a tunnel, seeing a light and beautiful colors, and hearing music. I have never forgotten this event, but I did not do anything with it. And in that time, I did not know that in human history, the same experiences have been told in many cultures and many times and many religions, as shown in this painting from 1480 by the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bos, showing deceased people escorted through a tunnel to the light. And only years later, in 1975, Raymond Moody first described these so-called near-death experiences, and only in 1986, I read about these experiences in the book by George Ritchie entitled Return from Tomorrow, which relates what he experienced during a period of clinical death of 9 minutes duration in 1943 during his medical study. And after reading this book, I started to interview my patients who had survived a cardiac arrest. And to my great surprise, within 2 years, 12 patients out of 50 survivors of cardiac arrest in the past told me about their NDE. For me, It all started with scientific curiosity, because according to our current medical concepts, it is not possible to experience consciousness with the possibility of perception during a cardiac arrest when circulation and breathing have ceased. I grew up in an academic environment in which I had been taught that there is a reductionist and materialist explanation for everything, and that it was obvious that consciousness was a product of a functioning brain. But now the phenomenon of near-death experience raised a number of fundamental questions. How and why does an NDE occur? How does the content of an NDE come about? How is it possible that patients can describe veridical details of their own resuscitation or operation? I was unable to accept most of the answers to these questions because they seemed incomplete, incorrect, or unfounded. But first, what is an NDE or near-death experience? Near-death experience seems to be relatively regularly occurring and to many physicians an inexplicable phenomenon and hence an ignored result of survival of a critical medical situation. An NDE can be defined as the reported memory of a range of impressions during a special state of consciousness, including a number of universal elements like seeing an out-of-body experience with veridical perceptions, pleasant feelings, seeing a tunnel, a light, deceased relatives, a life review, or the conscious return into the body. And many circumstances have been described during which NDE are reported, such as cardiac arrest, clinical death, shock after loss of blood, childbirth, coma following traumatic brain injury or stroke, near drowning, children, or asphyxia, but also in serious diseases not immediately life-threatening, during depression, isolation, or meditation. So apparently you don't always need a non-functioning brain to report an NDE. The NDE is transformational, always causing enhanced intuitive sensitivity, profound changes in life insight, and the loss of the fear of death. And near-death experiences occur with increasing frequency because of improved survival rates resulting from modern techniques of resuscitation. The content of an NDE and the effects on patients seem similar worldwide across all cultures and all times. However, the subjective nature and the absence of a frame of reference for this experience lead to individual, cultural, and religious factors determining the vocabulary used to describe and interpret the experience. According to a recent at-random poll in Germany and the USA, about 4% of the total population in the Western world should have experienced an NDE. So more than 9 million people in the USA, 600,000 people in the Netherlands, and about 20 million people in Europe must have had a near-death experience. Now, why do we physicians hardly ever hear a patient tell about their NDE? Patients are so reluctant to share their experience with others by all the negative responses they get. You have to be open to hear about an NDE. Patients must feel that you trust them and that you can listen without any comment or prejudice. But for most physicians, the NDE is still an incomprehensible and unknown phenomenon. Once a conference was held about NDE in a university hospital with more than 300 people in attendance. And at the end of the conference, after several lectures about NDE, a man stood up and said, "I am a cardiologist for more than 25 years, and I've never heard such absurd stories. This is total nonsense. I don't believe one word of it." Then another man got up in the audience and said, "I am one of your patients. I have had an NDE during my cardiac arrest, and you would be the last one I would ever tell." They feel exactly that this kind of physicians are not open to hear. So in 1988, we started a prospective study in 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals, with the aim to investigate the frequency, the cause, and content of an NDE. And this cartoon was published in a Dutch national newspaper when our study was published in The Lancet in December 2001. We wanted to know if there could be a physiological, pharmacological, psychological, or demographic explanation why people experience enhanced consciousness during a period of cardiac arrest. And we additionally performed a longitudinal study with taped interview of all late survivors within the 2 and 8 years following the cardiac arrest, along with a matched control group of survivors of cardiac arrest who did not report an NDE. And this longitudinal study was designed to assess if the transformation following an NDE is the result of having an NDE or just the result of the cardiac arrest itself. It was never been done in a prospective design. So the definition of clinical death was used for the period of unconsciousness caused by anoxia, of lack of oxygen in the brain due to the arrest of circulation and breathing that happens during ventricular fibrillation in patients with an acute myocardial infarction. And during clinical death, patients have no breathing, no measurable blood pressure, no body reflexes, nor any brainstem reflexes. And these patients will ultimately die from irreversible damage to the brain if cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, is not initiated within 5 to 10 minutes. It is the closest model to the process of dying. And in cases where memories were reported, we coded the experience according to a weighted core experience index. And in this system, the depth of the NDE was measured according to the reported elements of the content of the NDE. And the more elements were reported, the deeper the experience was and the higher the resulting score was. What we found is that 282 patients, 82%, had no recollection of the period of cardiac arrest, of the period of unconsciousness. But 62 patients, 18%, reported some recollection of the time of clinical death. And of these patients, 12%, 41, had a core experience with a score of 6 or higher, and 21, 6%, had a superficial NDE. And in our follow-up research into transformational processes after NDE, we found a significant difference between patients with an NDE compared with those without this experience. Patients with NDE did not show any fear of death. They strongly believed in an afterlife. Their insight in what is important in life had changed, and they often experienced enhanced intuitive sensitivity. And this process of transformation took several years to consolidate, with periods of homesickness, depression, and loneliness. So it's also a trauma. Now, which elements of the NDE were reported? In our study, about 50% of the patients with NDE reported awareness of being dead or had positive emotions. About 25% of the patients had an out-of-body experience. 30% reported moving through a tunnel. About 25% had communication with the light or observed colors. About 30% of the patients had an observation of a celestial landscape or had a meeting with deceased relatives. 13% experienced a life review, and 8% experienced a border. So in our study, all well-known elements were reported except a frightening NDE, but I know personally patients who had a frightening NDE. Now, what might distinguish the small percentage of patients who report an NDE from those who do not? We found to our surprise that neither the duration of cardiac arrest, 2 minutes or 8 minutes, nor the duration of unconsciousness, 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, so the severity of anoxia of the brain, nor the duration of unconsciousness, so nor the need for intubation in uncomplicated CPR, nor induced cardiac arrest in electrophysiological stimulation in the cath lab had any influence whatsoever on the frequency on NDE. NS is not significant. Neither could we find any relationship between the frequency of NDE and administered drugs, fear of death before the arrest, nor foreknowledge of NDE, gender, religion, or education. Atheists or Christians, of whom this didn't matter at all. Several theories have been proposed to explain an NDE. However, in our first prospective study ever, it could not be shown that physiological, psychological, or pharmacological factors cause these experiences during cardiac arrest. With a purely physiological explanation, such as lack of oxygen in the brain, most patients who had been clinical dead should report an NDE, because all patients in our study had been unconscious because of lack of oxygen in the brain resulting from the cardiac arrest. However, only 18% reported an NDE. And why only 18% report an NDE after cardiac arrest is still a big mystery. Besides, it is a well-established fact that people without any lack of oxygen in the brain, like in depression or meditation, can also experience an enhanced consciousness. Another theory holds that the NDE might be a changing state of consciousness, or the theory of continuity, in which memories, identity, and cognition with emotion function independently from the unconscious body and retain the possibility of so-called extrasensory perception. In 4 prospective studies with identical study design, our Dutch study, which was the only study with statistical analysis, 1 study from the USA and 2 studies from the UK, about the same percentage of NDE was found in a total of 562 survivors of cardiac arrest. Bruce Grayson from the American study writes in his comment that no one physiological or psychological model by itself could explain all the common features of an NDE. The paradoxical occurrence of heightened lucid awareness and logical thought process during a period of impaired cerebral perfusion raises particular perplexing questions for our current understanding of consciousness and its relation to brain function. A clear sensorium and complex perceptual processes during a period of apparent clinical death challenge the concept that consciousness is localized exclusively in the brain. And Sampani and Peter Fennick from the English study write that the data from several NDE studies suggest that the NDE arises during unconsciousness. And this is a surprising conclusion, because when the brain is so dysfunctional that the patient is deeply comatose, those cerebral structures which underpin subjective experience and memory must be severely impaired. Complex experiences such as reported in the NDE should not arise or be retained in memory. Such patients would be expected to have no subjective experience at all. And Penny Sartori from the other English study concludes that according to mainstream science, it is quite impossible to find a scientific explanation for the NDE as long as we believe that consciousness is only a side effect of a functioning brain. The fact that people report lucid experiences in their consciousness when the brain activity has ceased is, in her view, difficult to reconcile with current medical opinion. This lack of evidence for any other theory of NDE, the concept this far assumed, but never scientifically proven, that consciousness and memories are produced by large groups of neurons and are localized in the brain, should be discussed. How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death, even with a flatline EEG, and I'll come to it back later. Furthermore, even blind people have described veridical perceptions during an out-of-body experience at the time of their NDE. Scientific study of NDE pushes us to the limits of our medical and neurophysiological ideas about the range of human consciousness and the mind-brain relation. I would like now to discuss into more detail the out-of-body experience, OBE, during NDE. In this experience, people have veridical perceptions from a position outside and above their lifeless body. The NDEs have the feeling that they have apparently taken off the body like an old coat. And to their surprise, they appear to have retained their own identity with the possibility of perception, emotion, and a very clear consciousness. The range of vision can extend to 360 degrees with simultaneous detailed and bird's eye views. And even people blind from birth have reported veridical perceptions during NDE and OBE. This out-of-body experience is scientifically important because doctors, nurses and relatives can verify the reported perceptions. They can also corroborate the precise moment the NDE with OBE occurred during the period of CPR. In a recent review of about 100 corroborated reports of potentially verifiable out-of-body perceptions during NDE, Jan Holden has found that about 90% were completely accurate. 8% contained only some minor error, and 2% was completely false. And this proves that an OBE cannot be an hallucination, because this means experience a perception that has no basis in reality, like in psychosis. Neither can it be a delusion, which is an incorrect assessment of a correct perception, nor is it an illusion, which means a misapprehensive or misleading image. Moreover, one needs a functioning brain for experiences, hallucinations, delusions, and illusions. Additionally, OBEs with veridical perception from a position out and above the body have never been induced, despite mentioning this in medical literature, because only bodily illusions were induced by inhibition of special areas of the cortex, but never veridical perception from a position out and above the body. This real OBE is clearly shown in the drawing of a 6-year-old girl who nearly drowned and was resuscitated in the hospital in the United States. And in the drawing you see a happy and smiling girl up here watching her own resuscitation with many correct details like the external chest compression, etc. Doctor standing here. People from children from 6 years don't know exactly how to resuscitate people. And this is the report of a nurse of a coronary care unit. During night shift, an ambulance brings in a 44-year-old cyanotic, comatose man into the coronary care unit who was found in coma about 30 minutes before in a meadow. When we go to intubate the patient, he turns out to have dentures in his mouth. I remove these upper dentures and put them onto the crash cart. And only about an hour and a half, the patient has sufficient heart rhythm and blood pressure, but he is still ventilated and intubated, and he's still comatose. He is transferred to the intensive care unit to continue the necessary artificial respiration for 1 week, because he's another 1 week in coma. And after more than 1 week in coma, do I meet again with a patient who is by now back on the cardiac ward. The moment he sees me, he said, "Oh yes, you know where my dentures are." I'm very, very surprised. And then the patient elucidates, "Yes, you were there when I was brought into hospital. And you took my dentures out of my mouth and put them to that cart with all these bottles on it. And there was this sliding drawer underneath. And there you have put my teeth." I was especially amazed because I remember this happening while the man was in deep coma and in the process of CPR. It appeared that the man had seen himself lying in bed, that he had perceived from above how nurses and doctors had been busy with the CPR. He was also able to describe correctly and to detail the small room in which he had been resuscitated, as well as the appearances of those present, like myself. So that was the OBE during cardiac arrest. And then the idea of somebody who was colorblind. I saw the most dazzling colors, which was all the more surprising because I am colorblind. I saw beautiful landscapes, meadows, mountains, and flowers. I can distinguish primary colors, but pastels all look the same for me. But suddenly I could see them all kinds of different shades. Don't ask me to name them, because I lack the necessary experience for that. And then here's an account of a patient who had an NDE with an out-of-body experience caused by complications during surgery. So he was on general anesthesia as well. No, I'd never heard of near-death experiences, and I'd never had any interest in paranormal phenomenon or anything of that nature. What happened was that I suddenly became aware of hovering over the foot of the operating table and watching the activity down below around the body of a human being. Soon it dawned on me that it was my own body. So I was hovering above it, above the lamp, which I could see through. I also heard everything that was said. "Hurry up, you bloody bastard," was one of the things I remember them shouting. And even weirder, I didn't just hear them talk, but I could also read the minds of everybody in the room, or so it seemed to me. It was all quite close, I later learned, because it took 4.5 minutes to get my heart, which had stopped, going on again. As a rule, oxygen deprivation causes brain damage after 3.5 minutes. I also heard the doctor say that he thought I was dead. Later he confirmed saying this, and he was astonished to learn that I had heard it. I also told them that they should mind their language during surgery. Next up is the account of Vicky, a woman who was born blind. She was born extremely premature in 1951 after pregnancy of only 22 weeks and immediately placed in a very primitive incubator and administered 100% oxygen. Such a high concentration of oxygen damaged the development of the eyeball and the optic nerve, which doctors were not aware of in the early days of the incubator. Vicky suffered complete atrophy, withering of the eyeball and the optic nerve, and the visual cortex also failed to develop properly. And in 1973, when Vicky was 22, she was hurled out of a car in a traffic accident. A basal skull fracture and severe concussion left her in coma, and she had fractured neck and back vertebrae and a broken leg. She caught a brief glimpse of the car wreck from above. As a blind woman, she could see and recognize the smashed Volkswagen van. And later, in the emergency room where she had been taken by ambulance, she was able to see from above a body on a metal gurney. She also spotted 2 people and could hear them talking and expressing their concern. It was only when she recognized her wedding ring, which of course she knew only by touch, that she realized that it was her own body. And after she had gone up through the ceiling, she saw the roof of the hospital and trees. Quote, "I have never seen anything, no light, no shadows, no nothing. A lot of people ask me if I see black. No, I don't see black. I don't see anything at all. And in my dreams, I don't see any visual impressions. It's just taste, touch, sound, and smell. But no visual impression of anything." The next thing I recall, I was in Harborview Medical Center and looking down at everything that was happening. And it was frightening because I'm not accustomed to see things visually, because I never had before. And initially, it was pretty scary. And then I finally recognized my wedding ring and my hair. And I thought, is this my body down there? And I'm dead or what? They kept saying, "We can bring her back, we can bring her back." They were trying to frantically work on this thing that I had discovered was my body. And I felt very detached from it and thought of, so what? And I was thinking, what are these people getting so upset about? Then I thought, I'm out of here. I can't get these people to listen to me. And as soon as I thought that, I went up through the ceiling as if it were nothing. And it was wonderful to be out there and be free, not worry about bumping into anything. And I knew where I was going. As I was approaching this area, there were trees and there were birds and quite a few people, but they were all like made out of light, and I could see them. And it was incredible, really beautiful. And I was overwhelmed by that experience because I couldn't really imagine what light was like. And then if deceased acquaintances of relatives are encountered and seen in another worldly dimension, they are usually recognized by their appearance, and communication is possible through thought transfer. Quote, "During my cardiac arrest, I had an extensive experience, and later I saw, apart from my deceased grandmother, a man who looked at me lovingly, but whom I did not know. More than 10 years later, at my mother's deathbed, she confessed to me that I had been born out of an extramarital relationship, my father being a Jewish man who had been deported and killed during the Second World War. And my mother showed me his picture. The unknown man that I had seen more than 10 years before during my NDE turned out to be my biological father. So I have to come to the surprising conclusion that in our study during cardiac arrest, all these reported perceptions during NDE-OB were experienced during a transient functional loss of all functions of the cortex and of the brainstem with a flatline EEG. But how do we know that the EEG is flat in those patients with cardiac arrest? And how can we study this? Through many studies with induced cardiac arrest, both in human and animal models, cerebral function has been shown to be severely compromised during cardiac arrest, with complete cessation of cerebral flow, causing the clinical findings of the sudden loss of consciousness, the loss of breathing, apnoea, the loss of all body reflexes, which is a function of the cortex, but also the loss of all brainstem reflexes, like the gag reflex, the corneal reflex, and fixed and dilated pupils. And the electrical activity in the cerebral cortex, but also in the deeper structures of the brain in animals, have been shown to be absent after 10 to 20 seconds, a flatline EEG. And in an acute myocardial infarction, the duration of cardiac arrest at the coronary care unit is always longer than 20 seconds, usually at least 60 to 120 seconds. And in the hospital wards or in an out-of-hospital arrest, it even takes much longer. So all 562 survivors of cardiac arrest in the 4 prospective studies must have had a flatline EEG. Well, this conclusion is often called impossible and unscientific. The quite often proposed objection that a flatline EEG does not rule out any brain activity because it is mainly a registration of the electrical activity of the cerebral cortex misses the mark. The issue is not whether there is any brain activity of any kind whatsoever, but whether there is a measurable brain activity of the specific form regarded by contemporary neuroscience as a necessary condition of conscious experience, with visible activities in many neural centers, the so-called global neural workspace. And it has been proven that there is no such specific brain activity at all during cardiac arrest. But how could the clear consciousness with the possibility of perception outside and above one's lifeless body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death or coma, when patients are apparently unconscious or even under general anesthesia? In my recently released book, Consciousness Beyond Life, which was a bestseller in the Netherlands with more than 100,000 copies sold within 1 year, I describe a concept in which our endless consciousness with declarative memories finds its origin in and is stored in a non-local realm as wave fields of information. And the brain only serves as a relay station for parts of these wave fields of consciousness to be received into or as our waking consciousness. The function of the brain should so be compared with a transceiver, a transmitter-receiver, or interface, exactly like the function of a computer. Different neuronal networks function as interface for different aspects of our consciousness. And the function of neuronal networks should be regarded as receivers and conveyors, not as retainers of consciousness and memories. In this concept, non-local consciousness is non-rooted in the measurable domain of physics, our manifest world. Our enhanced consciousness resides not in our brain and is not limited to our brain because our consciousness is non-local and our brain has a facilitating function and not a producing function to experience consciousness. In trying to understand this concept of interaction between non-local consciousness and the material body, it seems appropriate to compare it with modern worldwide communication. There's a continuous exchange of objective information by means of electromagnetic fields for radio, TV, mobile telephone, or laptop computer. At this very moment, we are invaded by hundreds of thousands of telephone calls, by hundreds of radio and TV programs. But we only become aware of these electromagnetic informative fields at the moment we use our mobile telephone or by switching on our radio, TV, or computer. And what we receive is neither inside the instrument nor in the components, but thanks to the receiver, the information from the electromagnetic waves becomes observable for our senses, and hence perception occurs in our consciousness. Internet with more than 1 billion websites can be received at about the same moment in the USA, in Europe, and in Australia and China, and is obvious not located in our laptop, nor is it produced by it. Conclusion. We have to conclude that we need a functioning brain to receive aspects of our non-local consciousness into our waking consciousness, and to add the information input from our sense organs and from our body into our consciousness. The brain functions as a transceiver or interface for this non-local consciousness. But who is seeing? The eye only receives electromagnetic informational waves with different wavelengths. It doesn't see colors. And the optical nerve only transmits electromagnetic information to the occipital lobe of the brain, causing activities in several parts of the brain as well. But still the question should be asked, who is seeing? The answer must be not the eye and not the brain. The fact that somebody who has been blind from birth as a result of atrophied eyeball and atrophied optic nerve, and who has an undeveloped visual cerebral cortex can nonetheless see people and surroundings during NDE raises significant questions. And moreover, when all functions of the cortex and brainstem have ceased during cardiac arrest, when the eyes are closed, and when the pupils are widened and not reacting to light anymore, and the EEG is flatlined, it sometimes happens that people can experience a clear consciousness outside their body with the possibility of theoretical perceptions out and above their lifeless body. However, this is possible according to our current medical knowledge. In all those reported and corroborated cases with theoretical perception during NDE, the reception ability of the brain and the eyes was obviously lost. The connection between the brain and consciousness was temporarily interrupted. But apparently, non-local consciousness with the possibility of perception still existed. So we don't need a functioning brain, nor a functioning eye, nor a functioning optical nerve to have perceptions. But obviously, we need a functioning brain to share with others these theoretical perceptions that occur during cardiac arrest or coma. For me, it seems obvious that non-local consciousness itself is that perceives, because it's only our consciousness that is determining how we perceive our subjective reality. Everything originates from consciousness. But how this perception is possible is still a great mystery. Thank you for your attention.